Hi, what's up, Elliot? I'm Alan Chappell. I am currently the VP Design at Box. VP of Product Design at Box. Currently worked there for about 5 years. Previous with that, 20 years experience in the more consumer market. So that's the high level TLDR.
Awesome. And we've talked before, and we can go back and forth all day about a bunch of random stuff, but we're going to try to focus today more on the design side. And
we're not going to talk about sports.
We're not talking about sports. We're not talking about the Knicks. But we'll save that for the next episode.
Cool.
So I'll jump right in. You're a senior design leader today, but you've had quite a journey to get where you are, and I've heard a lot about it. So I want the audience to hear a bit about your design journey leading up to your current role and some big influences and experiences that you can call out.
Yeah. So as you know, my background was all over the place, right? Like it started off a lot in the music industry, like working as a designer in like kind of a boutique agency, musical digital design, working everything across websites. Again, so just for everybody, full disclosure, we're talking about like the early 2000s. This is where this all started, and working in the music industry for a boutique agency, doing everything from like websites, packaging, and things like that. Freelancing for various artists, right? Like kind of doing the same thing, building their web presences and web presence and things like that. Kind of just jack of all trades, right? Like doing everything from motion graphics to, like I said, packaging design, video. It's kind of like Swiss Army knife, kind of old school designer kind of position. Then after kind of like those early stages is kind of working up through, WWE, so World Wrestling Entertainment, as a digital designer. Funny story on that. I reported into Shane McMahon. He was really excited about kind of like the digital presence in like social networks and things like that, and started working on those. And, and even built my first mobile application. So this is pre-iPhone. It was on these things called, we used WapText, which had like 2 megabytes. That was the max size you can build for your application on those things. It was wild. So everything was like kind of like email tables and cells and things like that. But the point is that like that's where I met my first mentor, right? Like, and his name was Ross Anger, is Ross Anger. And he at that time, like, is definitely very raw, kind of like just design everything. Like I'm an artist at heart, dude. Like it's one of those things that I never really thought about, like the science behind design, right? Like it was very much more the art piece, and he was the first one to kind of introduce me to that. So with him, after spending my time there, I followed him over to CBS. So like very much media company, like kind of things, like dabbled in product design, but not really, I would call myself a product designer whatsoever. But then moving into CBS, it got a little more into that product design, like, data driven, across 27 local affiliates. So we kind of managed like CBS local across those. And then what was interesting, the big transition in my move to the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, there was a point in time where I was really influenced by a lot of the things that were happening there, right? And I needed to get out there somehow, to kind of like, you always run into these people that like you think you're I think I'm awesome, I think I'm great at all this stuff, but then you run into awesome, and then you see awesome, and you're like, okay, I got my work to do. And it was really interesting. The reason it happened more so than not was my daughter was born. So, family life changed, everything changed. So for me to take care of like my family, I had to expand my career and actually be able to do more. So kind of forced it. I took the first job I could, to come out here. Basically I was under the kind of like willing to clean toilets, basically was my whole thing, to be able to get out there and do that. Right. Like, pay wasn't much more, like everything. And it's like, we're living on like a $20 a day budget, like things like that. And it was really interesting. Like, I just took the first job, but then I landed, my next experience was like at Pandora. Pandora was awesome. It was an experience. I wouldn't even call it a job. Mm-hmm. There I got to like kind of like dabble across, and I'll get to the leadership point really quickly. dabble across, you know, brand, advertising, marketing, product. Like, so it kind of like touched you. Like, you know, when I moved there, we weren't that large of a creative team. So we kind of, there was product designers, but like there was the whole design organization. We kind of like touched all these areas of the product. So that's where I met the kind of like my next mentor, Tony Calzaretta, who was the VP of design there. And I got to follow like his journey and stuff like that. So, you know, one of the interesting things, and then kind of like moved to Smule, which is a, you know, social network built around music, because I really wanted to learn social graphs and how they worked with it. And then now landed at Box. And it's really interesting when you think about it, right? So the decisions along the way, right? Like, so I just kind of outlined kind of from a high level, like, you know, where I went, but it wasn't about where I went. It's about who I intersected with. Right. It's all about the team. It's all about the people. And I am absolutely humbled by the amazing people I've had the ability to like learn from, be influenced by. Like I talked about my two mentors, but also the designers themselves. Right. And things like that. So like the path to leadership wasn't planned. All right. So like it kind of went against everything I felt as an artist. Right. Like just in general. Right. Like, you know, when you're in kind of those like that space, right? Like you're like that very creative space. There wasn't this thought of design leadership. I think it just happened organically throughout. And what was interesting is that the reason was we've all had bosses, we all had leaders, we've all had managers, but you have that one manager or have that one leader that like really cares and really cares about the team, like authentically. And you know, then you're like, oh, well, like maybe, and you start to realize like you're starting to do that for other people as well, more so on an IC level, maybe mentorships and things like that. But the path was really interesting. Like just full disclosure, like the thought of a design executive is high imposter syndrome for myself. I never would think about that, right? Like meaning that like, you know, at the end of the day, yeah. At the end of the day, like, you know, my 14-year-old self, who I talk with quite often, is always looking at kind of the craft of everything. And that is the thing that drives me. That wasn't the thing that like, the goal was never like, you know, design leadership and things like that. I just wanted to continue to build my craft and through design, and that path to leadership, just kind of, like I said before, just kind of organically grown into it. And, you know, the qualities I learned from other people. So one thing really quickly was like, you know, and I know we'll get into this, but like, it was all about the teams.
Yeah.
Like I, you know, just for kind of like full disclosure, I went to a no-name art school, right? I didn't have kind of like the technical abilities a lot of these people had. So being kind of that sponge from both soft skills, hard skills, scope, and all those other things, and learning from others is what kind of grew me into what I'm doing now, right? Like, so I have a lot of people to thank. We hit the life lottery. We get to do design for a living. And at the end of the day, sometimes I lose that perception, right? Because it is a job.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like really getting back to the kind of like the roots of why we do what we do.
Find that motivation every day. Yeah. And that kind of gets into my, what was going to be my second question was kind of around like for the IC designers that are still, you know, in that stage right now, kind of your journey to leadership. And so, I mean, to summarize, it's kind of like, don't focus too much on like, don't like have VP of design at Box on your, like on your whiteboard every day. Right. It's kind of falling in love with what you're doing. And that kind of gets you there.
I'm just design at Box.
Yeah.
Right. Like, because, you know, hierarchies are important in certain cases, right? Mostly to run interference and a lot of things like that to create spaces for people so they can be successful.
Goal, it's not what you look for.
No, I mean, it becomes obviously your growth stages, but I think, you know, when you talk about career goals and going up, it was always the next step. Right. I think a lot of times we focus like but it's two-way street, right? Like, so, you know, sometimes you're focused too far down the road and you're like, one day I'm going to be like, lead this large organization when you're coming in early. No, my focus was more on, you know, getting better at what I'm doing and then taking the steps doing that. I mean, to be fair, like obviously that those things came into play. But for the most part, if I had to say 80-20 rule on it, it was more focused on me growing as an individual and incremental steps up there. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so you teed me off great. And you said we're going to talk about it, and we are. Let's talk about Box. Let's talk about team structure. What does your team structure look like today? And like, how many designers do you have roughly guesstimate? And who else in the organization is your team like externally collaborating with?
Yeah. So when I started, so 5 years ago, when I came in, we're still a very lean team. So I have studs on my team, just really, just be very clear. So, you know, when you work with lean teams, like you need to make sure you have, the putting in the people in the right places. So when we started, we're a very flat organization, right? So currently it doesn't sound like a lot, but we currently have 25 folks on our product design team. Now that means, but at the time when I started, we had 8 or 9, it was 8 or 9 or something along those lines. And so it's triple the size, right? But triple, you know, and it expands. And we also have an awesome team in Poland now as well. So it expanded outside of, so like outside of Redwood City, outside of that. And now we're all over the United States, as well as, like I said, an awesome design team in Poland. So through that, like we moved the org shape into, you know, from flat and wide and trying to move to a more structured, creating growth opportunities and other leadership roles besides. And, you know, also from my own personal standpoint, is removing myself as a single point of failure. You know, one thing that was really, really important, and I'll get into kind of like the, you know, the triad and who we intersect with and stuff like that. But like, as a leader, you have to be very, intellectually honest with yourself, meaning that like, you have to know what you're good at. You have to know what you're not good at. And then you also have to surround yourself with people that are good at those things that you're not. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, I can go across my whole leadership team currently, right? Like there's certain folks that are more pragmatic than I am, that understand the intersection of business, especially as it relates to SaaS of UX, than I do. Right. Like there's people that are more focused on kind of like you know, there's people that are just workhorses that just knock stuff out really quickly. And all these folks are better than I am. So my job is to take kind of that and put them in the right spaces where those things can flourish while they're growing their opportunities, or also doing the same thing as myself, where they're putting other folks around them to help it. Complementary aspect is what I'm talking about, basically, when you're kind of growing your team structure, right? You don't want a bunch of people that look alike. Mm-hmm. Best design teams are Motley Crews. They come from all different backgrounds. They come from all different areas. They all have different hard skills. They all have different soft skills and things like that, which was, you know, the transfer for me to leadership, dude. Like that was the hardest thing I had to do. Like the IC transition leadership. And I know we're talking about org structure, but I think this also comes into play. Mm-hmm. Was that I hid behind hard skills for way too long. And I think that people nowadays have a much more, you know, like I would say the people that are earlier in their career are light years ahead of where I was when it comes to that understanding, right? Like a lot of times, like, because like, again, like closeted artists, like hood on in the dark,
right?
Just wanting to focus on that. I never really started to grow those things till a little later on. But and again, the influences that come around it. But going back to kind of like our team, and I think this is very relevant when you start thinking about those particular skills and soft skills, you know, the intersection that we have to do with our go-to-market teams and customer success, right? Being able to understand the voice of the customer, right? It's a lot different than consumer, where you could just kind of, you know, we can kind of walk out in the street and go to a Starbucks and run a usability test, right? Like it's a little more difficult because well, there's also the use cases, right? Like the use cases are so like there's thousands of them, right? Like versus like 5 or 6, or and when you start digging into personas, it gets even more difficult to actually target your audience. So I think those are some of the things that like we've worked on when you talk about the org shape, the people we intersect with, and working on ways and better ways to kind of validate with those customers specifically, because a lot of it comes down as feature requests are specific, like large whales or large customers that need these things. Because one of the interesting things is that, like, no, design, we're always focused on retention, and a lot more so in I would say in SaaS, it's more like churn reduction and a lot of things to make sure we're keeping those customers happy.
Right.
So it requires us to intersect with a lot of those folks, but also to create visibility into all the things that we do, right? Like, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges for organizations that I've seen, is making sure everybody is in the know and aligned on a lot of things. So, you know, while we're a very lean team, because like just very, very quickly, like we have 25 on the design team, but just FYI, we have about 75 product managers.
Right.
So obviously it requires us to be very, very thoughtful, and also very transparent about what is going on. And to be fair, like there's the ideology behind the things that we do, and there's the practical application, which becomes a little more difficult, right? No matter how agile or anything, any company is, there's a lot of ad hoc that goes around in it. And we try to do our best to kind of mitigate that as best as we can. Yeah.
So, and you know, you're mentioning all these demands that your design team faces, including the fact that you guys are such a lean team. So, you know, how do you help your team kind of maintain that balance between optimizing for speed while not killing, you know, that passion for their craft, which you mentioned is so like important?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody on here has the silver bullet to fix that, please let me know. But it is a difficult thing, right? Especially now, because like here's kind of what happens. The business side, right? Like when you look at, and this is where design gets stuck in the middle, right? Everybody, there's this assumption that you can have all sides of the iron triangle, right? Meaning like, okay, let me explain it really quickly. Because it's like, all right, like let's keep the cost down. Let's move really fast and have high quality.
And usually you only get two.
You at max, you usually get two, because if you have a lot of money, efficiency and craft or quality are really easy to do, right? If you can go slowly, you can have low cost and you can produce high quality because you can do all the research and you have the time to do it. So when you talk about efficiency and craft, right, like you're removing that ability a lot of times for designers to actually go deep, right? So and again, I have to give more credit to my team on particularly on this question. What we kind of do is try to think about like, well, what are the critical pieces of that, right? When you're starting to do depth, and so like, you know, maintaining the craft and quality of what it is, right? Like, yes, we would all love to do like these really deep studies on a lot of things. The great thing about designers though, the designers that we have on our team, particularly at Box, is that they have an amazing ability to get the right amount of data that they need to be able to execute, right, within the timelines and the constraints. That's where all the creativity happens, right? It's within the constraints you're given, right? Like, yes, we all love greenfield and blue sky and be able to create all these amazing ideas. But once those constraints are put into place, you actually see how what's best for particular individuals, right? Like how they go about doing things. And everybody's a little different. But like one thing they've been really able to do is like, you know, kind of figure out a way to kind of get those critical pieces in it. And to your point on like the craft with the efficiency, it's very difficult to move away from the mundane for product designers, right? You get stuck in dev support.
Yeah.
You're running really fast. You're kind of stuck in a lot of things. So, you know, another aspect of it is like that balance of science and art. I think sometimes we go very, very far towards the science and like micro optimization, like, you know, micro optimizations, iterate on the same thing over and over and over again, just to kind of move numbers. Sometimes we kind of lose the plot a little bit of why we do this in the first place, right? Like why we love doing it in the first place. And that's when it becomes more of a job than kind of like your passion. So, you know, what we try to do is and again, I'm talking ideology, not always like ideology goals that we try to do. And yes, we're able to do this in pockets, but practical application becomes a little difficult to be able to do those zoom out phases, because I think one thing that people should understand is that designers need to see what's going on everywhere, right? And especially in a large enterprise across a platform, they have to understand like how all these pieces connect. So allowing them that ability to do that, or creating those spaces for the designers to do that, whether it's official or unofficial. I prefer official just so we can hold accountability across the organizations to do that, which becomes a little more difficult. But like that ability to kind of zoom out and that incubation period, right? Like think about after your planning meetings and things like that. Like you just want to stare at a wall for 20 minutes and I'm like, just to really think about the problem a little more, or like I can even talk about in the past where designers would just go out and eat lunch or go to the bar with some of their engineering and product partners just to kind of shoot it and just try to figure out what is the best path to be able to do that. So I think, the one critical area and the one critical piece in all of this, and stuff that, I do well sometimes, but also not so much other times, is like, what is that fun piece? Like, how do you bring that fun back into what we do? And it's something we struggle with all the time, to be fair, because it's just that constant, it's that constant pressure and that constant push. So how are we able to pull out? And a lot of it's all about like evolving and maturing as an organization and as individuals, right? There's certain folks that get, they really want to go, like, there's certain designers that really want to go deep on stuff. And there's other designers that like to float around and look at, like, and need that change of scenery often and often. Like, some people can context switch really well. Other folks like to go like further down, kind of like, for lack of a better way to put it, like further down the rabbit hole to figure out where all the broken windows are on everything. And we have to identify who's that's for and what is the best value for both them, their career, as well as what they're doing long-term for the business. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. You're saying, I think you're doing a great job of teeing me up, because the next question, very near and dear to Zeplin's heart about like alignment and stuff like that. I'll get to that in a second. Just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions for Alan that you'd like him to answer afterwards, the Q&A function should be on the right side of your screen. It's a question mark, and you can also feel free to chat using the chat function. It should be top right on that little text window. Mm-hmm. Okay, so back to what I was saying. You mentioned all these things about being aligned, zooming out, and someone called it out in the chat. Being uninformed is being disconnected.
Yeah, good call.
Yeah, those are things that Zeplin, tries their best. We try our best here to solve for, especially in design teams. So I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that designer workflow. I know you and your team have a lot of experience using Zeplin in the past for a way to connect like design to development, especially at a large scale. I think first, how would you describe Zeplin to someone who is curious but doesn't know what Zeplin is?
Yeah, I mean, from a design side, this is a source of truth for what's going to go in market. Like, that's the easiest way I can explain it, right? Like, that goes back to like your point on alignment and workflows and things like that. And so able us to mitigate some of those challenges of alignment asynchronously. And I think that's a big part of it, because the last thing people want to do is have more meetings about the meetings, about the meetings, about the meetings, about the meetings. Yeah. Well, and even in Slack channels, right? Like, I don't know, again, I might just be speaking for myself, but sometimes I am terrible at Slack context, right? Like, I'll write something and they'll be like, what are you talking about? Like, and like, you know what I mean? So I think that with all the work that's in Flux specifically, whether you're in low, medium, or high fidelity, tools like Zeplin really help manage those workflows and visibility across functionally. And I think that visibility and alignment key is one of the most difficult things to manage as you scale, right? Because what inherently happens, because like when you're going into a new area and you're going to a new space and everything, things start fragmenting. And when things start fragmenting, silos start being created, and then more silos, and then more silos. So you're trying to create this kind of pyramid of, cascading triage and all this other stuff where, okay, you understand that you're cascading off of like these three big things for the company, and then things start to go on that. But when you're adding new products and new things, it's a new company strategy. So what happens is those bolt-on things, and then tools like, that can help align what's in market. And also, when you talk about, like, and I know we're going to get into like, the versioning and stuff like that. I think that's one of the key pieces, right? Like, knowing what changed, right? Like, identifying, like, especially if there's a drop, right? If there's a drop in engagement, or there's a drop in a certain way, did we cannibalize something? What were the things we changed? And sometimes it's hard to identify because you might have made 3 or 4 changes. So you can't, like, single variables, very easy to identify, single variable changes. Right. But at least it kind of takes away that friction for us to be able to have to go do that ourselves.
Right. Yeah. No, that's kind of like, our bread and butter, bringing that beyond design, like product engineering, other stakeholders like that. Yeah. So, here at Zeplin also, we think a lot about handoff, but we also think specifically about kind of the nitty gritty design documentation, organization, versioning, annotation flows. I go on and on. How important is it for you as a design leader, for your team to be able to have like a structured process for those types of things?
It's so important, right? It's so important, but it's a heavy lift, and sometimes it's an afterthought. right? Like that happens a lot because again, you're in the scrum, right? You're just racing to get this thing out. And sometimes like when you're you're skipping certain pieces to be able to do that and to get in and market. So, but to your question though, given like the timeline pressures and everything, it's extremely important. Again, I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about the versioning and understanding what has changed and what is not. I would say the hardest part of this process though is the governance, right? Like it kind of goes back to the silos and things like that. The governance and ownership of all this stuff and who is responsible and how do we maintain quality? Like what's your quality control look like? Like what is your centralized, like decentralized, like how do you do decentralize it, but also make it adoptable, but also centralize it in a way where we can enforce and, you know, not be a bottleneck, for lack of a better way to put it, but also be proactively trying to make things better. I think that's probably a struggle all designers have on almost a daily basis, depending on where you're working at, what stage in the project you're working at, and things like that. But like again, what I was saying before about the asynchronous ability that, you know, a tool like Zeplin creates to reduce that friction helps out a ton, to actually help gain that alignment, right? Like, again, I know I'm kind of saying the same things over and over again, but like, I think that like the tools that have that ability to align teams asynchronously are hyper important when there's like, you know, 270 plus P0s on your backlog. How are you going to track all of them? And then like, how are we like, whatever, like, how are we making sure that we're providing space for the designers to be able to provide evidence of why that was successful or why that might be successful, right? Obviously, until something is live, you're gonna always get surprises.
Yeah, definitely. And so, you know, talking about tooling, kind of from zooming out a little bit, not just Zeplin specific, but on the topic of tools, since they're so important to design and product work, especially within, you know, I guess I wouldn't, you know, would you call yourself a larger team? I guess it's like a lean team on a large company almost.
Yeah, we're a lean team in I would say a solid mid-sized company, right? So, like, so we're a very lean team. Yeah.
What's your approach then to tool strategy from that standpoint? Kind of what's your take on how teams and design leaders should be thinking about, you know, which tools do I choose for which job? How do you like build out that tool stack?
Yeah, and I think it's like a chain, right? Like it starts with people, right? So it's people, process, and tools, right? Like, so by the time you get to the tool portion, it's kind of to support the other first two, right? So at first you start with like kind of like, what are the general things that we all use, right? Like, you know, you have to have one unified design tool, right? Well, you know, went from Photoshop. Oh my God. If anybody here remembers using artboards for Photoshop, like it was awful. But then we move into Sketch and then Figma, but there was always one unified design tool, right? Like, and things like that everybody uses, right? Then like taking back to like kind of the people, you also identify like, you know, skills and strengths and really invest in those. And there's sometimes specific tools around those specializations, right? Like, you know, and again, the process comes into play too as well, right? I think sometimes when process is bad, right, and very ad hoc, people go over their skis a little bit and try to handcuff a lot of things, right? So you get too rigorous, right? Like, so you know, so philosophically, before we get to tooling, it's like, what is that balance of responsiveness and rigor? You know, as a designer, I prefer 20% rigor and 80% responsive. Engineering would probably disagree with me on that, and rightfully so. That's why it works, right? Like we have different perspectives and we come to an alignment. But then when it comes to tools, like, you know, like you said, like I said before, there's the global tools that everybody uses, but also the specific specialization tools. And again, prototyping comes to mind, right? When you think about prototyping, you're like, oh, we can prototype in Figma, and you're like, okay, but it's not very believable, right? Like, so then it's like you're going to bootstrap and do a usability test really quickly. And you want to like have that separation to like that you want to remove any of that disbelief that this thing isn't real. Then you use like quick and dirty prototyping tools like a Principle, right? But then if you want to go end to end and do stuff like, and again, I'm talking about different people on my team that use different tools to do this stuff, including myself, right? So by definition, I guess I'm a design technologist now, but we were just jack of all trades designer. I was good at everything, but not great at anything specific, FYI. And so, but when it comes to those tools, right, when you talk about prototyping, then you get to kind of the end to end, right? Like meaning that like there's certain people such as myself and there's a couple other designers in the team that we default to like Framer if we want to build in React Native, or using Xcode and Swift UI if we want to build like a local data model and then prototype using those tools. And then the engineers can laugh at us for our code. But at the same time, we're also showing them that like, hey, we're really thinking about how this will actually display in that. So the tool, when it comes down to that, and then there's the tools that are for, those are just design specific tools. And then you start looking at tools that are shared across the company, right? Like when you talk about like Zeplin and other things like that, Jira, for example, or if you use Asana or something like that, right? Where people are using it. I mean, some people, or folks use Notion and other things like to kind of manage workflows and stuff like that. And then you get into really specific niche, crazy tools that are kind of on like, you know, the like business process levels that have to be shared and you have to be learned. But again, if it comes down to the strategy for design specifically, it's really identifying like, you know, what are the global tools that we use? And that comes from a user pull, right? Like that comes from a demand from the designers, right? That we don't dictate. We're like, yeah, you're going to go use this tool. They're going to be like, yo, we need this tool. Yeah, it's a very bottoms up. Exactly. It's a very bottoms up approach. And I think that's it for all tooling. That's it localized within design itself, not so much shared across like, you know, like if you, you know, I mean, usability testing too, right? Like usertesting.com and things like that. Like that's a shared thing we use across design. Right. But like, yeah, the strategies varies on the use case.
Right. So to the designers in the chat that want, you know, a tool, you guys got to band together and then bring it to leadership because it's
and then we have to procure it, which takes a lot of time, especially we work at Box, so there's a lot of security involved through that procurement. Hey, you've been through it. Yeah. The security process takes a very, very long time because that is our bread and butter.
Yeah. So start now and then you'll do it. You'll get
It'll take about 9 months.
Yeah. So last question, and then we'll get into some Q&A. This is kind of, you know, zooming out and looking at the industry as a whole. With the way, you know, the industry is evolving, a lot of designers are questioning how their role will change in the future. Might have to say AI, but, you know, how do you and like how they would define their value going forward. So what's your take on that as it relates to both the craft of design and design leadership? And what do you think will remain the same versus what's going to be different 3 to 5 years?
That is, so you want to talk about a question that's really, really difficult to answer. This is a really good one. You know, and again, anybody, do not take my advice. Do not say this is concrete. This is my perception. This is my thoughts.
This is not professional advice.
Yeah, well, to be fair, like, just really quickly, total digression. A friend of mine introduced me to the founder of the app Tout, and Tout was Vine before Vine, and then before Musical.ly, and then before TikTok. And I'll never forget it. This is why I'm telling you, don't take my advice. It was a 15-second video flip, and I was like, this is giving me, I'm like going dizzy. I was like, no, and he was literally told me this isn't for you. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. Anyway, so on this specific question around like, what do you see changing and stuff like that? I think, well, there's not a specific answer because the designers are inherently homogenous, right? I think we look at, you know, and then I'll touch on the AI thing. There's so many different skill sets that I've seen grown over the last, I would say 15 years with designers. We went from strictly like UI, UX, and now I see designers doing a lot more strategy on the business side. They're filling in gaps on the PM side too as well. And also allows the PMs to do more strategic work as well. So there's a lot of stuff we share in that. But like, I think like as it changes, it's developing more of kind of these fundamental business aspects of design. I see that. And I also see a growth in specializations. And when I mean specializations, it's hard skills like in specific, but it's also specific verticals, right? You think about blockchain and things like that. Like blockchain design is very, very different, or map design or something like that. So I see more and more specializations kind of going at. Full stack isn't just going to be, and it's already happening. Full stack they included UI UX historically forever, right? Or UX UI. It's just, you know, and what I'm saying is I feel a lot of design, specifically design leaders, especially in that the middle to upper management layer, they're already doing a lot of this stuff, from program management, from product owner, and a lot of other things that they're taking on those tasks. So I see that in design, since we're actually connecting the dots with the humans and the users themselves, being able to pivot and connect those business aspects with it. Something I would have never thought about to it, because I was just like, I just want to design cool stuff. That's literally like, that was my goal, dude. And but like, the thing with AI, right? The one thing it's very interesting with AI is AI is a really good table setter for brainstorming. But like the one thing it doesn't have is the ability to react to human emotion.
Right.
See how somebody leans in. Like if you're running a like moderated usability test, right? See how somebody leans in on something, how they feel about it. Like how do you motion it? It's almost like the, measuring the timbre like of music and things like that. Like what is that emotional connection with it? And how do we expand it? Because remember, like AI takes from sources that are already existing. Right. So like, we've seen enough articles on like potential plagiarism and a lot of other things. But like the aspect of that is that designers will always lead. Everything goes in cycles, right? It's always an evolution, right? Like for design, just in general, think about it. Like think about travel, right? You like for how long the fastest you can go is that you can run. And then somebody's like, hey, let's go ride that horse. And they're like, oh, let's put some wheels on this thing. Let's make it a bike. And they're like, oh, hey, like how about a car? Like, and then like, oh, planes. And then like, oh, like, so it's just an evolution, right? While the modality may change over time, especially, it's not just AI, but it's the stuff like, VR and like all AR as well. Like, especially in like certain industries where the geofencing and being able to do that augmented reality and things like that. So I don't think it's going to change too much in terms of like, worried about being able to. I actually think there's going to be higher demand because those modalities are going to need somebody to look at it with fresh eyes and be able to kind of drive like the future evolutions of those. And that's something AI cannot do. Yeah.
So that's reassuring then. That's a reassuring note.
No, I mean, you'll have to adapt though, to be fair, right? Like you're like, it's like, okay, maybe not guaranteed to what we're doing today, but there will be some need and you're going to have to kind of like go after it. It's like anything else in your career growth, right? Like you see an opportunity, you go after it. You see this new thing, you go after it. So I think it's just like anything else, right? Like, we didn't know like all these tools and all these things just keep coming out, and there will be a next thing, right? There will be something else. So you just got to adapt to it.
That's pretty good advice.
We need creatives. We need creatives. Yeah.
So I'll jump right into the audience questions. I had one from Kieran. This was in the chat, but they said, how to deliver week over week. I have to stop thinking World of Warcraft when I see WOW. This is about doing more with less, kind of like and it speaks to your lean team at like the larger size company. So how do you deliver week over week with, your stuff's under pressure? How do you safeguard your design team when they fail?
Yeah. So we have a philosophy is like, failure, like there should be no fear of failure, because if you're not failing, you're not learning. Right. So we kind of set that precedent, I think, just at a high level. Like everything's iterative. You're never going to succeed unless you fail. So just first on that. But like the week over week protection, it's a great question. And it's not like, I don't think it's a one size fits all. But some of the things we do is just generally, set up the stand-ups, making sure we're providing support from other designers, other folks that are, everybody has their partners in go-to-market. Everybody has their partners in customer success. Everybody has their partners in that. And bringing those folks in to run, to also be advocates, right? Like for the designers as well, right? So it's a very much team-oriented aspect. From the week to week, it's just the check-ins, making sure we're providing visibility, managing if they have any blockers. And again, at the end of the day, it's like our job here is to run interference to make sure that they have the ability to focus on what they're doing. But like, like I said, there's not one size fits all. There isn't like some rubric that's going to say like this will produce that, or an algorithm that this will produce that, because every team, every PM, every designer, every engineer, they're all different. Right. So, we try to delegate as much as we can in terms of ownership. I think that's a big key too. I didn't mention it, but like delegating that ownership and allowing the teams to guide and sort of, and again, it's not like official racy daisy models, but they're like somewhat assumed in terms of like that ownership and being able to do it. And yes, and so when those things do fall down, because they do, when those things fall down, it's like making sure that designers have the comfort in being able to like escalate that up to us, and making sure that they're also protected in those situations. I think a lot of times people are sometimes just trying to struggle and fight through it. Just be able to have that candid conversation as soon as possible when those kind of situations happen, so we can fix it and rectify it, versus you trying to like solve it all on yourself because like at the end of the day, the other designer is also trying to protect the other designers. Right. So they're trying to take on all that themselves. And one thing I've learned very, very quickly is that you can't do anything by yourself.
Yeah, for sure. You get burnt out quick.
Yeah, burn out quick. I mean, you can do it, but like it doesn't mean it's really the best way to go about doing it. Yeah,
for sure. And this question is anonymous in the Q&A, kind of on a similar vein. There's from this person: we're feeling a lot of pressure at my company to, quote, do more with less. How does that play out at Box? Or what's your advice to teams that need to operate more efficiently?
Yeah. So, and again, like it's not really a single, simple answer, but I would say it just starts with kind of like what we were talking about before. It's just being candid and communicative. I think designers inherently, and this is myself too, so I might be a little biased in this. We like to please people, right? We want to be like, yes, we got this. Yes, we do it. Say no, but qualify it, right? And make sure that there's an alignment before you push back and say no, right? Like in certain things, or not. Like I prefer, again, it depends on your leadership and depends on your team. But like we have a lot of people that I prefer them to ask for forgiveness in those situations versus asking for permission. So like, just come back with like, hey, I'm not doing this. And again, but you do have to quantify any decision that you make, right? Like or qualify, I should say, any decision that you make, and let us handle kind of like the kind of larger aspects of it. Forced prioritization. I think that's another big one. I think, right, what I was talking about before about the, how the silos and the bricks are just getting wider and wider and wider. It's really tough to determine, well, which one's more valuable than that. Well, one of the hardest things that we've had to go through is forcing that prioritization. Prioritization across an entire organization is very, 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 very difficult. But within a pod structure, within your team, you should be able to do that and be able to ask for the accountability on prioritizing what is more important, why, and then making sure that we're focusing on kind of like that, and you can't do that with with the individual product owners, because obviously the individual product owners think their thing's the most important.
Right.
So like we need to have that more, I think, larger discussion on prioritization so we can start to enforce it. Because if we don't do that, we just become stretched to craziness. And some of it, and some of the difficult challenges is that it's like, well, all these projects are great. I want to work on all of them. And things like that. But prioritize your own time, like make sure you prioritize your time, but also with your manager and your other leaders, like help start forcing up some, prioritization or some validation, right? A lot of times just things come in that are just feature requests with no story, no problem statements and things like that. Push back on those, because those will actually make you more efficient, right? Like if those are provided versus you just randomly making some design off of a one-liner, and then those things are done and built afterwards. I think that's where a lot of the problems happen, right? Mm-hmm. Like working in that low fidelity and forcing that stuff back up. It doesn't, and again, it's very, I will say it's, this is kind of the definition of healthy tension, right? It's not something that's going to be greeted with flowers. You're going most likely going to get greeted with knives, which is why you need to lean on us in that. But like forcing prioritization seems to be, and to be fair, it's very difficult too, even in the smaller venues. But the best we can do that, I think, is kind of alleviate. It's asking that ever loving question: why?
Right?
Why? Like, they should be able to explain it. If we're going to invest engineering dollars and we're going to invest all this stuff in being able to do that, you should be able to express why this is more valuable than that.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question, kind of, and you were touching. You brought me back to this, talking about kind of like the silos and how that affects like workflow and process. When you think about like when you first involve like the dev team, for example, right? When you're designing a product, at what stage in, like, how early, I guess, do you bring devs in to say, like, this is what the design looks like? Like, how early are you bringing, like, whether it's in Zeplin or something else, like how early are you bringing the dev team in to be like, this is what's going on, and you giving them that transparency?
Yeah. So anybody who answers this question should be the devs should be brought in immediately once there's an idea, right? Because even though their discipline is more the building side, they help they give you an understanding of feasibility very early on in the process, right? So I'm talking about like problem statement, hypothesis, like bring them in, like do a design sprint right off the rip, and being able to them to kind of juxtapose like what the goals are versus what's feasible, again, because of the creativity comes in those constraints. So bringing in the engineers as early as possible, right? Like getting it, because they also have like some of the best UX ideas I've ever gotten were from engineers. Because like, again, I'm a designer. We all have iPhones in our pockets, right? For the most part, right? Like, and I'll never forget this. Like, and this was more, I presented something as a flow that would work cross-modally. And then one of the engineers goes, that's not how that works on Android. And you're like, okay, cool. And they're like, why don't you do this? And I was like, and of course we tested it, but like it was amazing.
Right.
Like, and I thought about this problem for months.
Right.
Right. And if just by bringing, and if I brought them in, so from that point on, I brought in engineers early every time.
Yeah.
Right. So like my point being is that like getting all those eyes and those different perspectives on a specific artifact or a specific object or a specific thing is so imperative, because it also counterpoints your points. It removes, because we all have biases as we approach anything. It's like that old thing of like stick a Coca-Cola can in the middle of the table, ask everybody to describe it in a few words, and you're going to get 15 different descriptions.
And you need that.
Yeah, you need them. You need them there. You need them there the whole time. And you also need them to be a part of why are we doing it? Because they also become your advocates as well, right? Like some of the challenges, like when we do kind of like the reverse of them, a lot of times we're stuck in this cart before horse, where we do the designs before like scenarios are set, before we really, really understand the use case, or before all that. Then there's questions popping up. Well, like, what's the value and what we're trying to do? And we have to kind of mitigate that like ad hoc. And doing that is a nightmare versus bringing them in early, because like, while we say, like I said, we lean, we have very restricted resources and things like that. Now you're wasting time spinning, right? So the earlier, and again, the key, everybody should operate like design. Like every person right now, probably on this call, anybody can go look at what they're designing right now, just going into like Figma, right? Like they can just go in there and see exactly what we're doing. So it's providing that visibility across and bringing those folks in early.
Yeah. And so I guess this is, kind of a build off of what we were just talking about. Dimitri asked, is there a balance of bringing engineers too early, but for a major impact versus, do you worry about creating distraction for engineers, or is that kind of like a good thing?
That's a great question. I think it's just like any other thing, right? Like, know your engineers, know who's down for that, right? Like, I think that like, just like design, there's iterators and there's strategy thinkers, right? Like there's certain people that love to flow in that creative aspect and actually come up with very good interaction models. So really identifying and there's other people that just want statement of work, right? Like, so you have to identify that, because then who asked that question, it's a very good point, right? Because it can become a distraction and it can become some of those things. So you really have to, so again, talking about people, remember we talking about people, process, and tools, right? You have to identify who those heroes are in your organization across all these different aspects. Who's really willing to crawl through that glass? Who's really willing to do it? Because a lot of us say it, but then like, it comes around, like, it's like the whole thing. You want impact, right? Like you want impact. I want growth. Well, here's the price you pay for impact and growth. Yeah. It's easy to say. Like, yeah, you don't get it for free. It's a lot easier to not want impact and growth, right? And just work on a thing of a thing of a thing. But to the question is, right, really identifying and to build those partnerships. So this comes back to kind of like the Scrum model, right? Like really getting to know who you work with, both and not on so much like deep personal level, but really get to that level where you can have healthy arguments, you can have all those things, and those are the people you want to bring in. Yeah, you don't want to bring in and then there's other folks, even myself. I caught myself doing this a couple of times where you're just like, no, right? Like you're just no. You don't even want to discuss it, right? You're just no. So you gotta kind of use other people that are pushing for that same thing you are, right? They want to do better. They know they can improve it and things like that. So really identifying who those partners are. Yeah. It's a great question.
For sure. So let's see, we've got a bunch of questions. Dimitri, I'll get to some of these, but I just this is also kind of touching on, something that's in this same vein. So, Tara, sorry if I mispronounced, asked, how can I effectively balance nurturing the creative freedom of my design team while ensuring alignment with business objectives and constraints? I think you kind of touched on this early in the call, but yeah, talk more about compromising on the quality of design.
Yeah.
Not compromise to meet outcomes.
Yeah. So I think, but one thing I didn't elaborate too much on that. So this is a great question. Like, I think it's just like choose your hills to die on and make sure the team's aligned on what those hills are. Right. Like I catch myself all the time. I mean, like you can even use like this example as an IC. How much time have you wasted? This is a question for designers. How much time have you wasted iterating on a piece of UI for multiple hours when you have an entire screen to do because you just kind of rat hole on that particular piece, and then you step away for 15 minutes and then you figure it out, right? Like, so we get caught up in that, which relates to kind of like the juxtaposition of like balancing and maintaining that quality by also doing that. I think it goes back to making sure you're aligning on priorities, right? Like, creating focus, right? So us as leaders, we have to kind of manage that the best we can. Obviously, as you well know, I work at Box and I deal with a founder CEO named Aaron Levy, who is very, very much involved. That's a little bit different of a scenario to manage. But at the same time, I think it's just like, really putting those things into practice and making it simple, right? Like, I think that's the biggest thing too. When we talk about like setting up these things, when I was talking about like, setting up prioritization, it comes down to people talking. It comes down to, again, it sounds remedial, but really making sure we're all saying the same things and getting that alignment. And then what is that space you need to create as a leader? So if the business is giving you friction, right? Like say you like, oh, we need to create a usability lab. And they're like, oh, no. Okay, well, just figure out a way to do that within your own area and then balance against the business. So sometimes you got to stick your neck out a little bit, because like if your team's having struggles in blocking, then you have to become the blocker. But again, qualifying the reasoning and around it and what we're trying to do and stuff like that. But like, it's really on a case-by-case basis. So it depends on your structure, it depends on your org, depends on your deliverables and things like that. But from a philosophical standpoint, make sure to put rules in place and also adhere to them the best that you can and enforce them the best that you can. But do it in a partnership aspect. So you have to do like, so, it's like astroturfing around your organization. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. Speak now or forever hold your peace, right? You do that with product, and then you do the same thing with engineering, and then you do the same thing with go to market, and then you do this. So you kind of got to do the round robin and kind of like let everybody understand. And even because you're not looking for, and don't look for confirmation bias, right? Everybody doesn't have to agree with it. Right. And I think that's one of the more difficult challenges, right? Like, I think like, 80-20 rule specifically on that 20, and the challenge you're going to have to mitigate as a design leader is that 20% is very loud, and they sound like they're the 80%.
Yeah.
So we have to mitigate that and run the interference for our teams. But I think, creating that visibility for all these other areas, it's something we had to do for user research. It's something that we had to do like, 6-9 months around the company to be able for people to understand that this is why we have to do X, Y, and Z for the design team, because they need to do this successfully for the business. Why people may agree or disagree, at the end of the day, we're going to move forward and being able to do it. And then and again, and always position it as like, we're going to test this out and it's going to evolve, right? That kind of sometimes lowers people's like we're not going to write this in stone, but like, we're going to try this, do a proof of concept on it, and we're going to iterate through it. So like, and then we'll receive feedback. So always allowing that back and forth too, like that, allow people to give you that feedback as things go along.
Finding that balance between like setting it in stone, but being willing, I guess, to change it up.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. Everything, we're malleable, right? Like we're used to kind of like going everywhere. So I think it's similar to how you're developing those processes, and it will change. Like the minute you have that thing locked down, something will change. Yeah. So like, it's like a design system. It's never done.
So we'll go 2 more quick questions. Then we'll let everybody go. Thank you everyone so far for staying with us. We're about just about there. I'll give you 5 more minutes. So this is from Dimitri. this was kind of early on in your call when you talked about kind of, I think, not mentioning how you don't really see yourself, as like a design leader day to day, right? So would be happy to hear more about how you manage the imposter syndrome, any takeaways. I'm 17 years into the design career and don't see it going away ever.
Yeah, so I am believe it or not, I am one of the most socially awkward, introverted people on the planet. So it took a long time for me to kind of get over that hump and kind of realize that, like, like if you ever do like a Myers-Briggs, right? Like my conscious and subconscious have become almost totally separate personalities, which is really interesting, right? Like when you really think about like what I think about because subconsciously I am the, all right, bye, I'm out, right? Like, but consciously, thinking about like that, it's always going back to kind of like why we do this, like why do I do this, and really thinking about that, and then kind of leaning into the team, right? The team helps my imposter syndrome, right? Like they are, building those supports around you and making sure, delegating ownership, like I talked about before, and as you're a design leader, sure, but at the same time, you're only as good as your team is.
Right.
In that sense. And that's the big change from IC, right? Like your whole life is like, from school, right? Academia, it's about my grades, my things, my done, and then your IC, it's about my projects and what the things I'm working on. And then all of a sudden you shift to this, like, oh shit, it's about everybody else. Apologies for the language, but you're like, this is actually about growing other people and letting go of other things and stuff like that. So that's one of the more difficult transitions on that. But the imposter syndrome piece on it, I like it. I actually like being an imposter, like in this sense, not in general, but in this sense, I actually like it. It keeps me, because like that, it goes back to the authenticity piece. So while I feel that way, the authenticity of who you are outweighs it by a million miles, because it's polarizing, right? People are going it's like never in history ever is like, oh yeah, that person's okay. Like when you're in a leadership position, it's polarizing. People are either going to love you or going to hate you, one way or another. And and I don't mean like visceral hate or things like that. They just might not like your style or what you do, and they don't agree with anything you say and stuff like that, and that's fine. And that's also why we're here. I actually so those are the people that kind of get promoted on my team, the people that like tell me to kick rocks and do that. But I think that that team around you is almost it's your support system to kind of manage your like kind of that syndrome of being able to do it, and allowing them to kind of not just fill the gaps on your hard skills, but also filling those gaps on your soft skills. So the team cohesion actually outweighs that way more. It helps me kind of feel like because then your whole percent, because then it moves away from you.
Yeah,
right. Like meaning that like.
Yeah.
It's like it's just like, okay, yeah, I'm a design.
They're here.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're here because I'm here. Yeah, 100%. All right, last question. This is a good one to end on. Alan, as a VP, where in the craft right now do you usually find yourself? What's your day to day?
So this is the funny part. Never in my career did I think I would be spending half my time talking about resourcing and budgets and mitigation and stuff like that. But basically, your design, you go from building the artifacts and the product all the time to providing, what feedback. And again, to be fair, just like this talk, 50% of the things I say are terrible. 50% of the things I say are good. Right. And again, that again, being authentic with myself, right? Like I'm just being intellectually honest, like again, because like, you understand as a leader, like you lack context a lot of the times, right? Like, so I'm coming in with kind of this blind side and things like that. So there's that piece of it, right? Like where you're not as deep into the product as you're really used to be. Yeah, you understand it. You can audit it end to end. But when you go into those deep micro interactions and stuff like that, it's a little unsettling, right? Like, and things like that. But then like the day-to-day looks more about like managing, making sure we're setting up the team, making sure we're resourcing, planning 18 months out of what our strategy is, and then working backwards against kind of the people, process, and tools that you were talking about. Like, what do we need to be successful? What do we have? What are our gaps? and then using your tool belt of what you have, right? Because like we all love a full tool belt, right? Like we all like, or if you want to use a poker analogy, you're like, yeah, I love having freaking pocket aces and stuff like that. But a lot of times as a design leader, you get dealt a 7-3 unsuited. And yes, that's the worst hand you can have in poker.
2-7,
2-7. My bad. 2-7. Yeah, you're right. Okay. So I need to play with you. So you have like, you know, you get what I'm saying though, right? So how do we work with that? And also not bring the team into those issues, right? Again, protection of a lot of that. So that's the day-to-day. It's like, again, running a lot of interference, but it goes both ways. It's protecting the design team to make sure that they're able to successfully execute, and relying on your managers to be able to handle that day-to-day, while at the same time mitigating at the higher level and planning 18 to 2 years ahead, and then kind of like reversing back like on it, because it's like playing chess.
Right.
Like, you know, but I feel like a lot of people right now, particularly in design, are playing chess on the clock, which is a lot harder.
Right. You don't get
I'm good at chess. I'm terrible on the clock.
Right. Let's take your time.
Yeah.
All right. Speaking of time, we're out of it. Alan, yeah, that was great. We got through everything. You didn't, you know, you promised you were going to go way over time, but you didn't. So congratulations.
Yeah. I have a habit of rambling on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah, we'll do that in a separate episode. We'll talk sports. We'll talk music. We'll talk the history of technology. Thank you everyone for taking the time to be here with us today. Again, this session will be will be uploaded to YouTube and emailed to everyone that registered. If you want to connect with Alan or myself, I just dropped our LinkedIns in the chat. If you want to keep up with more Zeplin events, we do stuff like this all the time. I was telling Alan before this call, this is my 10th webinar. So thank you, Alan, for being on as number 10.
It's a 10 shirt. The 10 shirt is one of the best shirts you can wear.
Yes, sir. So if you want to keep up with those events, you can use the landing page that I just linked there. Thank you again, everyone, for taking time out of your day to be here with us. And huge thanks to Alan. It was always great talking to you, man.
Yeah, Elliot, appreciate you taking the time as well. This was fun.
All right. I'll catch you soon.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
I'm going.